Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad on Capitalism Hits Home, an interpersonal update. This is a show about the intersection of capitalism, class, and our personal lives. I want to continue with my statements from the previous podcast, which is trying to explain what was ignited when the nation saw Derek Chauvin's police knee on George Floyd's neck until the life ebbed out of George Floyd, even as he said, "I can't breathe." We've talked about the problems and how for 50 years Americans saw their standards of life decreased. Partly what had happened in this country and why we don't have the kind of left we really need is that we had a peculiar set of circumstances. After World War II, 1 in 4 American families had a communist member, and that wasn't considered a big, dangerous, scary, awful thing, having a communist in your family, in your extended family. It was normal. The left and socialist parties and the Communist Party were very big. It was communists and socialists and the CIO together that organized the mass marches of the unemployed, demanding jobs at decent wages, that made so much fuss that FDR taxed the top at 98.6%. He got that by warning them, there is a mass movement here. You may lose it all if I can't tax you very high in order to pay for these things. And we got unemployment insurance. FDR had the WPA, which hired millions. All in all, he hired about 15 million people. The equivalent with our population would be if we had a president and a government that hired 30 million people, almost all the unemployed, to build bridges, to redo our roads, to create fast trains that every other developed nation has and we don't, to create universal health care and child care, to help farmers, to have education that really works and mass tutoring programs. All of these things, to break up the big banks. Those things are things we could, of course, achieve, but we don't have that kind of government. In fact, we have a corporate knee on our necks, a knee that's endorsed by our president and his Republican colleagues. However, one of the things that's happened as people have been galvanized by watching innocent people being clubbed, tear gassed, and in George Floyd's case, killed for the crime of trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. Just as Eric Garner was killed by the police for selling loose cigarettes. So that there's a terrible oppression of people trying to get by who are desperate. Now, what are we doing about it? Well, in addition to the militant demonstrations on which people have risked their lives in order to say, no, we need to change direction. Our lives matter. Black lives matter. And that means if the lowest people in the American crazed and horrible hierarchy, their lives matter, all lives matter. And everyone's out there demonstrating. You don't have to be black or brown to demonstrate. All races realize we're in this together and we need each other. Just as Martin Luther King realized that before he was killed, and so did Malcolm X, who said, we need each other, it's black and white together, we've got to bring class into this, and he was assassinated. Americans are also getting out from under, but I shouldn't digress. I should go back to explaining something. Why does all of Europe have strong left parties that also are union organizing parties? Why do their workers come out and demand things while we don't? What's going on here? Once, when I was in France, the government tried to deny some of the money for their excellent free child care centers because school is universal at 2 years old in France. And the 2-year-olds have these special little houses where each class has a master's degree teacher, an associate's degree teacher, and every child care center has a registered nurse and a sick room so that if your kid isn't feeling well and you have to work, you can still bring your child. Also, they get 3 meals, which are healthy and nutritious, and so on. Well, when they started to announce they were going to take some of the funding away, hundreds of thousands were in the street. Why? Why are they mobilized? Why haven't we been for the last 50 years and are only mobilizing now? Well, I think what happened is that after World War II, those people who let FDR proceed with the New Deal decided to take revenge and take back what people were given. The first way they did that was with a huge campaign against communism and socialism and left unionism, the CIO, which was an organization of millions of workers, the biggest union drive that ever happened. And it happened in many ways with energy and hope and participation by socialists, the two socialist parties of the time, and communists working together with labor union rank and file to make a powerful union. Well, at the end of the war, a war in which our most staunch and powerful ally was someone they called Uncle Joe. That was Uncle Joe Stalin, by the way. And the Communist Party was very strong. They decided, whoops, first thing to do is attack the communists as un-American. Thus, the Un-American Activities Committee of the Congress. Next is to attack both socialist parties as fellow travelers with the communists. Next is to make sure that the communists and socialists were ejected from the unions, which they did. The head of the AFL then, Philip Murray, pushed the policy to throw the leftists out of the unions. And they were a lot of the spark of the unions, which started going out. That flame started going out then to the point where instead of having 35% unionized, we have about between 7 and 9% unionized in this country, and the unions are not very militant. Sarah Nelson called for a general strike when Trump wanted the workers in airports to work without money, without being paid. But the AFL didn't do it, and they're not exactly apparent in the disaster that Americans are experiencing now as well, even though the class war means that with 41 unemployed and not employed by the government at decent salaries, employers can make their own terms no matter how humiliating. Well, after World War II, the onslaught began. It began with the anti-communist and anti-left crusades. It continued with legislation that was hurtful to labor. It continued by making an enemy out of unions and the left and extolling the wonderful contributions of various capitalists. So Jeff Bezos is seen as a hero, not as someone with just depraved indifference to human life while he exploits people to make even more money, even though he's the richest man in the world. Also, after World War II, America was the only strong economy standing. Russia lost 30 million people during World War II. All of Europe was decimated. We were the only economy standing and were very prosperous and could afford to give the American dream of a middle class, where if you were white and male or in a family headed by a white male, you got a family wage that could support your family and might allow your children to have a better life than you did. That's over. But that was the mythology of America. That's why we didn't realize that if we're going to improve our lives, we have to join with others. We'll never get it by ourselves. The ethos at that time, and at that time our country was basically a white country, which it isn't now. If you were white and male or in a family headed by a male who was white, you could have a standard of living that was a middle class standard of living at the time. That, of course, was taken away once huge corporations could make more money by exploiting Chinese workers or Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi workers. And so big unionized industries lost millions of jobs, and people were basically forced to have everyone in the family work, the wife and the husband, to make less than they used to, when only men, if they were white, could work and support families. So we got used to thinking we had a democracy, everybody could have a chance, you just have to work hard, you get an education, you have it made. Colleges have gone up more than 400% since that time, the college costs. And college doesn't guarantee you a job in any case. At Starbucks, all the baristas have college educations. Doesn't mean that they're making a middle class standard of living. And so we got used to the promise of the 50s, which depended on American companies having no competition, our having won the war, our having a new deal in place, and that deal is off now. Now the knee is on our necks. That's the bad news. The good news is that people are A, organizing in mass demonstrations and mass organizations, like Black Lives Matter, like the Democratic Socialists of America, who has seen its membership triple, and like many more organizations to help people. The Justice Democrats have stood up and said, we support everything that Bernie stood for and more. We support the $15 wage, $15 an hour minimum wage. Although they haven't said it, all over Europe there's also a maximum wage, which we certainly should support, but we support free, universal, quality health care. We support clean water for everyone. We support free college tuition. We support the breakup of the big banks who have only gotten bigger because they were bailed out, and with the bailout money, they continue to exploit us and have us pay higher fees and be rather reckless with our money. People have realized that if we're going to get anything here, what we have is our number. We have the population. We have the majority. They have the money. But if we stand together, we can win it. And one way that's quite palpable is the movement of the Justice Democrats, who are trying to bring back white working class voters to join the Democratic Party as Justice Democrats. I'm just going to take a little sip of tea. and to push the party to become a democratic socialist party, as Bernie envisioned. Now, a political revolution like that would require two things. One, a wave of candidates who are willing to support justice initiatives. And that does exist now. And the other is a population with the political hope and the will to do something. 13% of youth voters have voted in the last election in the United States. It means young people saying, I can have a voice. I don't want to give up. I want to fight back. I want to fight back and go to demonstrations, and it is mainly the young who are going on demonstrations, although it's all ages. I was moved to see a group of women in wheelchairs that had signs that say, this may take my life, but my life is being taken anyway. I stand with Black Lives Matter. I stand with the best America. It was very moving. And if the Democratic Party won't allow this, as they knifed Bernie in the back, then having a socialist party in the United States that will allow that. So that we need the will and the hope of young people. We already have young people in that over 50% now, although it's only 51% of young people prefer socialism to capitalism. That's a huge change. And so it would be not only being committed to a set of alternatives that improve the life of everyone, but actually voting for progressive candidates and getting out and doing something. Because even after the really brutal, senseless battles over Obamacare, which was hardly universal health care, just better than nothing, now the majority believe that we should switch to Medicare for all. 58% of Americans want to break up the big banks. 63% support $15 as a minimum wage. 78% of Americans support overturning Citizens United and not allowing money to determine elections. This is really striking because there's an openness to ideas that used to seem radical. For example, it would have seemed even 3 months ago totally radical to disband the police in a big city. Seattle has disbanded the police force and is starting to create community policing. Other people are opening up their police forces to scrutiny. In New York, they are eliminating 50A, which is a law that previous transgressions of police officers may not be made public. If they were, people might have noticed that Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, had 18 complaints for excessive force. So that I think we have to understand that there's a generation of young people who are facing that the knee on their necks is choking them. That if they go to school to have opportunities, they'll be in hock on average for 21 years. And they won't necessarily get good jobs. That even peaceful protesters can be clubbed and tear gassed. So that we have to understand that there is a sea change happening and help it happen. Bernie Sanders won the support of young people, hands down. He won the youth vote by more than 50 points. In his own home state of Vermont, he defeated Hillary Clinton among voters under 29 by 95%. So there is a sea change, partly because if young people don't act together, they will get nothing. They're in the situation that their European counterparts have always been in, which is you're not going to get benefits just because you're the richest country in the world and the only surviving economy. No, that's no longer the case. We're the richest nation in the world, but we're certainly not empowering our own citizens. And there are candidates that are running that have very different values. For example, in New York, there's someone called Debbie Medina who is running. I want to mention her first because she's running in the 18th district for state senate. She was, like a lot of the progressive candidates, she isn't just a political person. She used to be a housing organizer, and she talks with pride about how she created big apartment complexes into co-op housing so that the people in the cooperative decide what to do in the building and with the money. Her parents came to New York from Puerto Rico, and she puts it that they came straight from the island. And these are some of the things she says that I want to read to you because they capture a very different spirit from the spirit that our candidates have been allied with in the past. She says, "Capitalism is killing our neighborhoods. Before you know it, the non-rich, the non-white, none of us are going to be able to live here. This is a tragedy happening before our eyes. But the wealthy are not the only people with a voice. We're bringing a revolution to Brooklyn." That's really a change in candidate rhetoric, a change that was kind of spurred by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she won in her district, which had been ruled for 10 years by a man who lived in Virginia and only appeared on occasion, and was a Democratic Party hero about to have a more important post because of his tenure there. No one challenged him. He didn't even live there. Here are some of the candidates that are running that I think are hopeful and are evidence of a sea change in the United States. Tim Canova, who's running in Florida for the 23rd Congressional District. Jamie Raskin in Maryland. Tom Feigen, a senator running for Senate in Iowa. Donna Edwards, who's coming back to Congress in Maryland. Lucy Flores, Alan Grayson, Pramila Jayapal, Susan Randolph, Joseline Pena-Melnick. These are candidates that are running out of the convictions they had before they ran for office. They're running because they were activists. For example, Pramila Jayapal is a Washington state senator, and she founded the post 9/11 immigrant rights group, Hate Free Zone One America, and they run massive voter registration drives. She says, "The only reason I got into politics was I believed it was another platform for organizing. So that's what I want to do with my congressional campaign. We've brought in thousands of leaders, young people and people of color and women who never saw themselves as part of this democracy." So that I think there are very hopeful signs. We're not going to be killed by the knee on our necks if we organize, and people are organizing. They're convincing people in poor areas that there now is a chance that their vote can be counted in spite of votes being repressed as they were just so recently in the Georgia primary. One candidate, Medina, says, This election is just another rent strike. The difference is it's not just one landlord versus some of the tenants. It's all of the landlords versus all of the tenants. That's what I mean by class war. And it would be a mistake to overlook the idea that this year's election is playing out in a moment when protest movements are visible on the national screen. Black Lives Matter, fight for the $15 an hour, the climate movement, the Me Too movement. They're all movements that say, we're not going to be ashamed to be poor. We're not going to be ashamed to be sexually molested. We're not going to be ashamed to be Black. We're going to say shame on you for exploiting us. Shame on you for using us. Shame on you for acting like it's our inadequacy that we're used, rather than your predation. The candidates that are running on the Justice Democratic ticket are increasingly coming from progressive movements, movements for change, empowerment. They want to convince their people to take power, that they too can be like the European nations that did it. Because when I was in France and they had an election, they're not allowed to have any money, private money in elections. That doesn't mean that they don't sometimes cheat. Then they get discovered, like Sarkozy did. He lost, but he got discovered at a power luncheon at the Bristol Hotel, wildly expensive hotel in Paris, accepting an attaché case full of money from Ingrid Betancourt, who was the richest woman in France at the time. So that, of course, there are attempts in France and Germany and other places to buy elections. However, when that happens, those people are excluded. And when I was in France, it was during an election, and I was sort of surprised at how they handled it. They have 2 weeks to campaign, and that's all, and they're not allowed to have private money. So there were 8 candidates running, and each got up and had the same amount of time to explain their platform. That was the candidate. Wow, it was quite impressive. That's what we should have, no money in politics. That's why 78% of America wants an end to Citizens United, where huge corporations can be counted as citizens and give money in wild amounts in political action committees. There is change afoot. And George Floyd's image of being killed by police who were utterly depraved in their indifference to him reminded us as Americans that we have a leader, and many leaders actually, and a corporate ruling class from which our government is usually borrowed. For example, Trump's economics people come from Goldman Sachs. One of his economic advisors, Hassert, urged Americans to get back to work. Who cares if they die? Not that he said that explicitly. He said, this is our capital stock. These are stock, like bulls to be slaughtered. Let them go back to work. So what? So many unemployed, if they die, so what? There's more. We'll be making money. That's depraved indifference to human life. And people seeing that made them realize that's what we've had for the last 50 years, a knee on our necks. And we don't want it there. And we're no longer going to vilify and make enemies out of the left. We're going to fight for justice for everyone. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info.